The moment Rose Barrett saw the tall stranger step through the doors of the dusty Spur saloon, she felt the particular kind of dread that only comes from recognizing someone you had spent 3 years trying to forget. The year was 1882, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of everything, at the edge of the open prairie, at the edge of the cattle trails that pushed north from Texas, and at the edge of the kind of civilization that tried to hold itself together with telegraph wire and Sunday sermons. Caldwell was a border town in more ways than one, a place where cowboys came up from the south trailing longhorns and dust, where gamblers set up shop in establishments that smelled of whiskey and cheap tobacco, where women like Rose Barrett learned early that the world had very little patience for softness. Rose was 26 years old, and she had been working as a bookkeeper for the dusty Spur for 2 years, managing the accounts of the saloon's owner, a stout and generally decent man named Harold Fitch, who trusted her with his ledgers precisely, because she was meticulous, precise, and entirely uninterested in stealing from him. She was not a saloon girl, though men sometimes assumed otherwise when they first walked in and saw her seated at the small desk near the back wall, her dark hair pinned up neatly, her eyes sharp and green as late summer grass. She wore practical clothing, clean cotton dresses in muted colors, nothing that invited attention, and she had cultivated over the years a kind of invisible quality, a way of sitting still and speaking little that caused most men to look right through her. She had told herself she preferred it that way. She told herself that every single morning when she walked the 2 blocks from the modest boarding house where she rented a room to the saloon where she worked, and every single evening when she walked back. She told herself that she was content with her quiet life, with her careful columns of numbers, with the small stack of novels she kept on her nightstand and read by lamplight when the nights grew long. She told herself she was not the kind of woman that men remembered. And then Clarence Malone walked through the door. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps it was just that she had tried so hard to shrink him in her memory, to reduce him to something manageable. He had the same broad shoulders, the same unhurried way of moving that suggested a man who had never once in his life felt the need to rush toward anything. His dark hair was longer now, curling slightly at the collar of his dusty trail coat, and there was a beard where there had previously been only stubble. He wore a Colt on his hip as most men did in Caldwell in those days, and his boots were the boots of a man who had ridden far to get somewhere. His eyes found her immediately. That was the thing about Clarence Malone that Rose had never been able to explain to herself or to anyone else. He always found her immediately, as if she were the only fixed point in whatever room he entered, as if some compass inside him was permanently set to wherever she happened to be standing. She looked back down at her ledger. Her pen kept moving. The numbers continued to be added. She was a professional, and she was not going to allow Clarence Malone to disrupt her columns simply by existing in her general vicinity after 3 years of absolute silence. She heard his boots on the wooden floor. She heard the scrape of a chair being pulled from the table nearest her desk, which was not even a customer table. It was Harold's private table that he used for meetings, and she heard the weight of a man settling into that chair with the particular ease of someone who did not feel the need to ask permission. "Rose Barrett," he said. His voice was the same. Low and deliberate and warm in a way that was almost unfair, like a fire that someone had built in a cold room without asking whether you wanted to be warm. "Mr. Malone," she said, not looking up. There was a pause. She could feel him looking at her. She pressed her pen harder against the page. "You are not going to look at me," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am working," she said. "You have been working for the last 30 seconds with the same expression a person gets when they are trying very hard to pretend that something is not happening." She finally looked up. It was a tactical error, and she knew it the moment she made it, because looking at Clarence Malone directly had always been the problem. He had eyes that were an unusual shade of gray, almost silver in certain light, and they were currently fixed on her with an attention that felt uncomfortably like being read. "What are you doing in Caldwell?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which she considered a small victory. "I came to find you," he said simply. The words sat between them like something dropped from a great height. Rose set her pen down very carefully, because if she was not careful about it, she was going to press too hard and snap it, and good pens were not cheap in Caldwell. She folded her hands on the ledger. She looked at Clarence Malone with the expression she had developed over 2 years of dealing with drunk cowboys who thought they could charm their way out of paying Harold's tab. "You have wasted a trip," she said. "I have been in 6 towns in the last 3 years," he said, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the table. His coat fell open and she could see the badge pinned to his shirt, a deputy marshal's badge, the silver catching the lamplight. "I followed up every lead I had. Tucson first, then Abilene, then a stretch through Colorado that I would rather not repeat, and then I heard from a cattle buyer in Wichita that there was a woman matching your description working books for a saloon in Caldwell." Rose stared at the badge. "You are a deputy marshal now." "Since about a year after you left Dodge City," he confirmed. Something shifted in her chest. She did not allow it to show on her face. "That is a respectable position," she said. "It is," he agreed, "though it did complicate the looking somewhat. Hard to chase a person across Kansas when you have got federal responsibilities keeping you somewhere else for stretches at a time." "You should not have been chasing me at all," she said. "I left Dodge City without any obligation to inform you of my destination. We knew each other for 4 months, Clarence. 4 months is not," she paused, searching for the right word. "4 months is plenty of time," he said quietly. She stood up from her chair. Because staying seated while having this conversation felt like a disadvantage she could not afford. She was not a tall woman, 5'3" on a generous day, but she straightened to her full height and looked at him as directly as she could. "I need to finish these ledgers before Harold returns from the Cattlemen's Association meeting," she said. "If you want a drink, the bar is that direction. If you want conversation, I recommend any of the other 12 people currently in this establishment. I am sure any of them would be delighted." "Rose," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Malone." She sat back down and picked up her pen. He did not leave. He sat there at Harold's table for the better part of an hour, saying nothing, ordering a single whiskey from the bar that he nursed slowly, and doing absolutely nothing except existing in her peripheral vision. It was, Rose decided, the most effective form of torture she had ever personally encountered. Better than shouting, better than pleading, better even than anger, which she could have managed perfectly well. He was simply there, patient and quiet and immovable as a mountain, and she found that her columns were adding up incorrectly for the first time in 6 months. Harold returned at 9:30 in the evening. He was a heavy-set man of 50-odd years with a gray mustache and the slightly harassed expression of someone who had recently sat through a 2-hour meeting about cattle tariffs. He stopped when he saw Clarence sitting at his private table and looked between his deputy marshal and his bookkeeper with the careful expression of a man who could read a room. "I see we have a visitor," Harold said. "Deputy Marshal Clarence Malone," Clarence said, rising and offering his hand. "I am passing through. I hope I have not inconvenienced you by taking your table." "Not at all," Harold said, shaking hands with the slightly stunned expression of a man who had not expected his quiet bookkeeper to have a federal lawman come looking for her. He looked at Rose. Rose kept her eyes on her ledger. "Well," Harold said after a moment, with the wisdom of a man who had survived 20 years in the saloon business, "I believe Miss Barrett has just about finished for the evening. Perhaps you would like to walk her back to Mrs. Elroy's boarding house, Marshal. The streets have been somewhat lively of late." Rose looked up sharply. Harold met her gaze with perfect innocence. "That is very kind," Clarence said, before Rose could object. "It is entirely unnecessary," Rose said. "Miss Barrett," Harold said gently. "3 of the Taggart crew rode in this afternoon, and they have been at the bar since 4 o'clock. It would ease my mind considerably." Rose looked at the bar, where three large cowboys were indeed conducting themselves with the particular enthusiasm of men several hours into their drinking, and then she looked at Harold, and then she looked at Clarence, and she recognized that she was, in fact, outnumbered by circumstance. "Fine," she said. She closed the ledger, capped the ink well, stacked everything neatly in its proper place, and retrieved her shawl from the hook behind the desk. She walked to the door of the saloon without waiting to see whether Clarence was following. She knew he was. She could hear his boots on the floor, that particular unhurried pace that she had apparently memorized without meaning to. The night air outside was warm and dry, carrying the smell of dust and horses and the distant prairie. Caldwell after dark had a rough energy to it, cattle town noise, laughter and argument spilling from the various establishments, the occasional sound of a fiddle from down the street. The moon was a clean white crescent above the plains, bright enough to cast soft shadows on the unpaved street. They walked in silence for most of a block. "You are angry with me," Clarence said. "I'm not angry with you," Rose said. "I'm completely indifferent to you." "You are walking at the pace of someone who is angry," he observed. She slowed because it was true and she disliked being caught in a falsehood. They walked another half-block in what she attempted to make a dignified silence. "Why?" she finally asked, and the word came out with more raw feeling in it than she had intended. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They were in the space between two buildings, where the lamplight from the main street did not quite reach, and in the dimness she could see him turn to face her fully. "Why did you look for me for 3 years, Clarence? We had 4 months. You are a deputy marshal, you have a life. Why would you spend 3 years? Because I thought about you every single day," he said. The words fell like stones into still water, and the silence that followed them was absolute. Rose looked at him. She searched his face for the performance of it, for the practiced charm that men in saloons deployed toward women they found interesting for a fortnight. She found none. Clarence Malone looked exactly the way he always had, straightforward and steady, like a man reporting a plain fact about the weather. "That is not," she started. "Every day," he said again, quietly. "I would be out on the trail, or in some town that looked like every other town in Kansas, and something would happen the way the light fell, or someone would say something, or I would see a particular kind of stubborn expression on someone's face, and I would think about you. Every day, Rose." She felt something crack very slightly in the careful architecture of her composure. She turned away from him and started walking again. "I'm not the kind of woman that men remember," she said. Her voice was even. She had worked very hard to make it even. She heard him fall into step beside her. "I know that is what you believe," he said. "I know because you said it once in Dodge City. You said it to me once in the fall when we were sitting outside Mayfield's store and you were reading and I was—" He paused. "I was trying to find an excuse not to go back to my office. You put your book down and you looked at me with that look you have, and you said, 'Clarence, you ought to find yourself someone worth keeping company with. I am not the kind of woman that men remember.' And then you went back to reading." Rose stopped walking again. They were in front of Mrs. Elroy's boarding house, a 2-story frame building with a lamp burning in the parlor window. She turned to look at him. "You remembered that," she said. "I have thought about it approximately 1,000 times," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement and not quite pain, because it was the most wrong thing I had ever heard a person say about themselves. The lamp in Mrs. Elroy's parlor threw a warm rectangle of light across the porch steps. Rose stood at the foot of those steps and looked up at Clarence Malone, and she felt for the first time in 3 years the terrifying sensation of a door opening inside her that she had believed she had permanently sealed. "You cannot simply appear after 3 years and say things like that," she said. "I know," he said. "I do not expect anything from you, Rose. I want to make that plain. I'm not here to demand anything or to make your life difficult. I needed you to know that I looked for you, that it mattered to me. Whatever you do with that is entirely your business." She looked at him for a long moment. The night sounds of Caldwell continued around them, distant music, a horse somewhere, the dry wind from the south. "How long are you in Caldwell?" she asked. "I have a week before I need to ride back to Wichita," he said. "I have some business to conduct here as well. There is a warrant outstanding for a man named Douglas Farr who was last seen in this area. I am not here only for you," he added quickly. "I would not have come if there had not been a legitimate reason to ride through." She noticed the slight awkwardness in that qualification and found, despite everything, that it moved her. Clarence Malone was a man who needed to be honest even when honesty was complicated. "Good night, Clarence," she said. "Good night, Rose." She went up the steps and through the front door of the boarding house without looking back. She climbed the stairs to her room, lit her lamp, sat on the edge of her bed, and stared at the wall for a considerable amount of time without reading a single word of the novel on her nightstand. Every day, he had said. Every single day for 3 years. She put her face in her hands and sat with that for a while. The following morning arrived with the particular brilliance that the Kansas plains specialized in during late August, a blue sky so clear and deep it almost hurt to look at, the sun coming up over the flat horizon like something announced. Rose woke early as she always did, washed her face in the basin, dressed carefully, and went downstairs to Mrs. Elroy's dining room for breakfast. Mrs. Elroy was a widow of 60 who ran the boarding house with the efficient authority of a former schoolteacher, which is in fact what she had been. She served her boarders eggs, bread, and strong coffee every morning at 7 o'clock, and she had opinions about everything which she shared freely. "That young marshal was asking about you this morning," Mrs. Elroy said, setting a plate in front of Rose with the casual air of someone mentioning the weather. Rose looked up from her coffee. "He came here. He ate breakfast at the hotel and then walked past on the street and happened to see me sweeping the porch," Mrs. Elroy said, sitting across from her with her own cup. "We had a very pleasant conversation. He seems a serious sort of young man." "He is," Rose said carefully. "He told me he has known you from Dodge City," Mrs. Elroy said. "He did not say more than that, and I did not ask, because I am not the sort of woman who pries." She paused with the composure of a woman who absolutely would pry if given the slightest opening. "We are acquaintances," Rose said. Mrs. Elroy regarded her with the expression she reserved for arithmetic that did not add up. "Acquaintances," she repeated. "Precisely. Men do not ride 600 miles to see acquaintances," Mrs. Elroy said, and returned her attention to her breakfast with the serenity of someone who had made her point. Rose finished her eggs in silence. The morning at the saloon was quiet, as mornings generally were. Harold came in at 9 to go over the accounts from the previous night, and Rose presented them with the neatness he expected and the accuracy he had come to rely on. They discussed the ordering of whiskey supplies, a small discrepancy in the card room, receipts that Rose had already traced to a dealer's arithmetic error, and the upcoming cattle drive through town that would bring business and complications in roughly equal measure. Harold did not mention Clarence. Rose was aware that this restraint cost him something. Around 11 o'clock, while Rose was drafting letters to the 2 suppliers Harold used in Kansas City, the door of the saloon opened and Clarence came in. He was in his working clothes today, the Deputy Marshal badge visible, his coat clean, his manner purposeful. He nodded at her desk and then went to speak to Harold, who was behind the bar. They had a conversation that Rose deliberately did not attempt to overhear, and then Harold pointed him in the direction of the back office, and they both disappeared through the door at the rear of the building. Rose looked at her letter. She read the same sentence 4 times. 20 minutes later, Clarence came back through from the office and stopped at her desk. "Harold says Douglas Farr has been seen around the stockyards at the south end of town," he said, in the tone of someone reporting business. "I do not know anything about Douglas Farr," Rose said. "I know," he said. "I was not asking, I was just talking to you." There was a slight self-consciousness in this that she found unexpectedly disarming. Clarence Malone, who had tracked a fugitive across 3 states and worked for the federal marshal's office, was awkward about talking to her. She set her letter down. Harold mentioned a cattle auction on Thursday, she said, because it was something to say. The Lovell brothers are bringing a herd up from Texas. It will be busy. I remember cattle auction days from Dodge City, he said. Have your books ready. I always have my books ready, she said, with a precision that made him smile. It was the smile that undid her a little. It was the same smile, quiet and genuine, starting at the corners of his eyes before it reached his mouth, the kind of smile that was entirely unperformed. Would you take a walk with me this evening? He asked. Not, he added quickly, not to, I would simply like to walk and talk, if you are willing. If you are not willing, I understand, and I will go find Douglas Farr and be useful and leave you to your evening. Rose looked at him. After dinner, she said. I eat dinner at Mrs. Elroy's at 6. I will be at the corner of Main and Foster at 6:30, he said. If you come, I will be very glad. If you do not come, I will understand. He tipped his hat and left. Rose stared at the door for a full 30 seconds before she picked up her pen again. She was at the corner of Main and Foster at 6:25. She told herself this was because the boarding house was slightly closer to that corner than she had remembered, not because she had been ready early and then sat in her room for 10 minutes with her hands folded in her lap, arguing with herself about whether to go at all. He was already there. He looked up when he saw her, and something in his expression relaxed in a way that suggested he had not been entirely certain she would come. They walked south along the edge of town, toward the open prairie where the houses thinned and the grassland took over. The evening was long, the way August evenings were on the plains, the sun still well above the horizon and the light golden and slanting across the grass. In the distance, a hawk circled. The air smelled of dry grass and the faint sweetness of wildflowers that grew in the low places where the creek ran. Tell me what you have done for 3 years, Clarence said, and the question was simple and genuine. She considered being evasive. She decided against it. I left Dodge City in October of '79, she said. I went to Tucson first because I had heard the dry air would help with the cough I had that winter. It did. I worked in Tucson for about 8 months bookkeeping for a general store. Then the store's owner decided to sell and relocate to California, so I moved on. I spent time in Abilene and then I came here. She paused. Caldwell has suited me. Harold is a fair employer. Mrs. Elroy is good company. The town is rough but manageable. You like it here, he observed. I have built a life here, she said, with the particular emphasis of someone pointing out a relevant fact. I have savings. I have work. I have a room of my own and books on the nightstand. It is not a spectacular life by the measure of most people's ambitions, but it is mine, and I made it myself. It sounds like a good life, he said without irony. She looked at him sideways. Most men would find that kind of life inadequate, she said. A woman alone, no husband, no children, working books in a saloon. I am not most men, he said simply. No, she agreed quietly. You never were. They walked in silence for a moment. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass. Tell me about the Marshal work, she said, because she was aware that the conversation had tilted too far towards something intimate and she needed to level it. He told her, and he was a good talker when he had something real to discuss, practical and precise, with a dry humor that surfaced occasionally. He told her about the warrant work, about riding through Indian territory, about the complexities of trying to maintain law in a land that was simultaneously the domain of the federal government, various tribal nations, cattle interests, and railroad companies, all of whom had different and frequently incompatible ideas about what law meant. He spoke with respect about the territory and its peoples in a way that Rose noticed, because not all men did. He mentioned the Osage and the Cherokee with the matter-of-fact decency of a man who understood that this land had not always been the way it currently was arranged. You have thought a great deal about justice, Rose said. It is difficult not to in this work, he said. I have seen the law applied in ways that have not been just. I have also seen it applied well. I try to be one of the people who applies it well, but I am not always successful. That is more honest than most men in your position would be, she said. "Honesty is important to me," he said. "I would rather tell you an uncomfortable truth than a comfortable fiction." Something in the way he said it made her stop walking. They had reached the edge of where the town gave way entirely to prairie, the last house behind them, the open grassland spreading south into the deepening evening, the sky enormous and beginning to turn colors at its western edge. "Why me, Clarence?" she asked. "Truly, not the poetic version. Why did you spend 3 years looking for a woman who told you plainly that she was not worth the effort?" He stood beside her and looked at the prairie for a moment before he answered. "Because you were wrong," he said. "And because everything you said about yourself, all those careful ways you had of making yourself smaller, of making yourself easier to overlook, none of it was the truth of you. The truth of you was the woman who stayed up until midnight finishing accounts, because she had given her word they would be done. The woman who gave half her week's wages to the widow whose husband died in that freight accident in October, and then sat with her for 2 hours because she didn't think anyone should have to grieve alone. The woman who argued with Marshal Hensley in front of the entire town when he tried to run the Comanche family off the Grierson land, and did not back down even when he got red in the face about it. He paused. That woman is worth finding. That woman is worth 3 years. Rose stood very still. The wind moved through the grass around them. She had forgotten about the widow. She had forgotten about the argument with Hensley. She had not known that he had seen either of those things. "You watched me," she said. "I paid attention," he corrected gently. "There is a difference. I paid attention because you were the most interesting person I had encountered in a long time, and you kept trying to convince me that you were not." She turned her face away from him, toward the prairie, and blinked several times because her eyes had become suddenly and inconveniently wet. "I am going to need some time," she said after a moment. "I know," he said. I have not." She stopped and started again. 3 years is a long time to be alone, and I have gotten accustomed to it, and I am not certain I know how to unaccustom myself. "I am not asking you to do anything tonight," he said. "I am not asking for promises. I am asking if you will let me take you for a walk in the evenings and perhaps a meal, and talk to you the way I should have talked to you in Dodge City before you disappeared. That is all." She looked at him over her shoulder. The western light was full on his face, amber and kind, the way light gets in the last half hour before sunset. "Walks and meals," she said. "Walks and meals," he confirmed. "That is a very modest proposal for a man who rode across 6 towns in 3 years. I have learned some patience," he said, and the quiet warmth in his voice made something in her chest loosen in a way that was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. "Walk me back," she said. They walked back through the early evening toward Mrs. Elroy's boarding house, and the conversation was lighter on the return, finding its easier register. He told her about a preposterous incident involving a runaway mule in Abilene that had somehow ended with him temporarily responsible for 3 orphan chickens, and she laughed, a real laugh, the kind that she had not had cause for in longer than she wanted to admit. He left her at the porch steps with the same courtesy as the night before, tipping his hat, saying good night in his unhurried way. She went inside and sat on the edge of her bed again, but this time she was smiling. 3 years he had thought about her, every day. She picked up her novel, but found that the fiction on the page was considerably less interesting than the fact of her own life. The next 2 days passed in a particular kind of suspense that Rose had not experienced since she was much younger, and had not yet learned to be careful with her heart. She did her accounts. She spoke with Harold about the preparations for the cattle drive Thursday. She helped Mrs. Elroy repair the porch railing on her afternoon off, holding the boards while the older woman worked the hammer with the competence of someone who had been maintaining a house alone for 12 years. Clarence conducted his business about Caldwell with a professional thoroughness that she heard about in pieces from various sources. Harold mentioned he had been talking to the stockyard managers. The telegraph office clerk mentioned he had been sending wires to Wichita. And old Pete Calloway, who swept the street in front of the hardware store, told her that the marshal had broken up an altercation between two of the Taggart crew and done it without drawing his weapon, which Pete found impressively economical. Each evening he was at the corner of Main and Foster at 6:30. Each evening she was there at 6:25. On Wednesday evening, they sat outside on the bench in front of the hardware store because the evening was hot and the bench was in the shade of the awning, and Rose asked him about his family, which she realized she had never thought to ask in Dodge City. He was from Missouri, he said, a town called Hannibal on the river. His father had been a ferryman. His mother had taught him to read, which he credited with most of the good things that had happened to him since. He had a sister 2 years older named Me, who was married to a wheat farmer in western Kansas and had 2 children, a boy of 7 named Henry and a girl of 4 named Louise. "You are an uncle," Rose said. "A fairly attentive one," he said, "though the distance makes it complicated. I try to visit when the work allows it." "Do you like children?" she asked, and then felt her face grow warm because the question had come out with more weight than she had intended. "I do," he said, without any apparent awareness of her embarrassment. "Henry is very serious for 7 years old. He likes to explain things at considerable length. Louise has strong opinions about everything and makes them known to anyone within earshot." He smiled. "I think she will give someone a great deal of interesting difficulty when she is older." Rose smiled too, looking down at her hands. "You speak about them very fondly." "They are the best people I know under the age of 10, he said. "Do you want children of your own?" she asked more softly. He was quiet for a moment and she looked up to find him looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "I would like a life," he said carefully. "A home, a person to share it with. Children, yes, if God and circumstance permit it. I have spent enough years moving across this territory to know that I want something that stays in one place." He paused. "I have been thinking about what that might look like, whether I could remain in the marshal's work and still have that kind of life. Whether there are towns that need a permanent marshal rather than a circuit rider." "A town like Caldwell," Rose said before she could stop herself. His eyes met hers and something passed between them, quiet and enormous. "A town like Caldwell," he agreed. Rose stood up from the bench abruptly because she was sitting on a public street having a conversation that had just taken on dimensions that required considerably more private thought. "I need to go," she said. He stood. "I said too much." "No," she said honestly, "I just need to think." He nodded, and that was one of the things about him. He understood the difference between being dismissed and being trusted with something that required time. She went home and thought for a long time. The cattle drive came through Thursday in the way that cattle drives always came through Caldwell, with noise and dust, and the smell of several hundred longhorns, and the accompanying retinue of drovers who had been on the trail from Texas for the better part of 2 months, and were ready to spend their pay with the enthusiasm of men released from a sentence. The auction went through the stockyards at the south end of town in the morning, and by afternoon the drovers were distributed throughout the establishments of Caldwell, with the expansive good humor that followed being paid. Harold's bar was busy from noon onward. Rose stayed at her desk through the afternoon, keeping the books current in real time, the way Harold liked her to do on drive days, and the saloon moved around her in the particular organized chaos of peak business bottles being opened and closed, the piano player working through his repertoire, the laughter and argument and occasional song of 50 men in a small space. She was deep in the Friday accounts when she heard the commotion. It started at the bar, a raised voice, then several, then the particular sharp silence that a room gets when something is about to go wrong. Rose looked up. There was a man at the bar who she did not recognize, not a drover, too well dressed for that, wearing a coat that was expensive enough to be out of place in Caldwell's rough commerce. He was arguing with Harold loudly about something she could not quite hear over the general noise, and there was a heat to his manner that suggested a man who was accustomed to getting his way and was encountering unexpected resistance. Then she heard Harold say Douglas Farr. She was out of her chair before she was fully conscious of deciding to move. She went to the back door of the saloon, the one that opened onto the alley, and she ran the half-block to the telegraph office where she had seen Clarence go that morning on his business. The telegraph clerk, a young man named Thomas, looked up startled as she came in. "The deputy marshal," she said. "Where is he?" "He went to the stockyards about an hour ago," Thomas said. Rose turned and went back out, walking quickly down the main street toward the south end of town where the stockyards were, which was 12 minutes on foot. She made it in 9. Clarence was at the stockyard fence talking to one of the auction managers. He saw her coming while she was still 20 yards away, and the expression on his face changed immediately, not alarmed but sharp and attentive. "Douglas Farr is in Harold's bar," she said when she reached him. His hand went to his badge, then to his weapon, checking in the automatic way of a man making sure his tools were in order. "How do you know it was him?" "Harold said his name," she said. "They were arguing." Farr looked like he was about to make trouble. "Go back to Mrs. Elroy's," Clarence said, already moving. "I am not going to Mrs. Elroy's," she said, falling into step beside him. He looked at her sideways as they walked. "Of course you are not," he said, and there was something in it that was almost, despite the circumstances, affectionate. "I can go back to the saloon and keep Harold calm," she said. "Someone should be there who has a clear head and is not going to escalate things." "That is actually reasonable," he said after a moment. "I know it is." They came back through the main street at a pace that was quick without being a run, because running in a cattle town during drive day was the kind of thing that started panics. Rose peeled off at the front door of the saloon and went in through the main entrance while Clarence went around to come in through the back. The situation at the bar had developed further in her absence. Harold was very still behind the bar in the way that a calm man gets when he is close to the edge of his calm, and the man Rose had identified as Douglas Farr had 2 of the drovers engaged in what appeared to be a business negotiation of some kind, the nature of which she could not determine. Several other patrons had moved away from that section of the bar, with the instinctive spatial arrangement of people who wanted to be somewhere else. Rose walked back to her desk, sat down, and picked up her pen. She was watching the back door. Clarence came through it exactly 2 minutes later. He moved through the room without hurry, without the theatrical tension that lesser men used in these situations, and he stepped up to the bar beside Douglas Farr with the ease of a man ordering a drink. She could not hear what was said. She could see the moment Farr recognized what was happening. His body stiffened. His hand moved, and then stopped, because Clarence had placed his hand on Farr's arm in a grip that the room only half noticed. There was a conversation of perhaps 3 minutes, during which Harold very slowly moved away to the far end of the bar, and then Clarence and Douglas Farr walked together toward the back door in the manner of 2 men who were having a private conversation and were gone. The room let out a collective breath. Harold looked at Rose. Rose looked at her ledger. "Good girl," Harold said quietly. She was still writing numbers 2 hours later when Clarence came back in, without Douglas Farr, and with the expression of a man who had filed the appropriate paperwork. "He is in the jail at the end of 2nd Street, he said, stopping at her desk. "Sheriff Atkins is holding him until I can arrange transport to Wichita." "Good," she said. "You ran to find me," he said. "I walked quickly," she corrected. He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Rose." She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized now. It was the same expression she had seen on that bench outside the hardware store and at the edge of the prairie on that first walk, a look that was careful and full of something that he was not yet giving himself permission to say in full. "You would have found him eventually," she said. "Perhaps," he said, "but you made it simpler and faster, and you kept Harold steady." He paused. "You are a remarkable woman, and I know you do not want me to say that, but I am going to say it anyway because it is true." "Clarence," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The saloon moved around them, the drive-day noise beginning to taper now as the afternoon shifted toward evening. "Have dinner with me," she said. "Not a walk, An actual dinner. There is a restaurant on Walnut Street that serves decent food. His face did something quiet and wonderful. I would like that very much, he said. They ate at the small restaurant on Walnut Street, which was run by a Mexican woman named Senora Vargas who had come north with her family 15 years earlier and had built something excellent with what she had available. The food was good, proper food, not saloon fare, and the tables had actual tablecloths, and there was a lamp on each table that cast a warm circle of light. They talked for 2 hours. They talked in the easy, deepening way that people talk when they have stopped pretending to be merely casual. He told her about the loneliness of the circuit work, the way that moving town to town made it hard to feel rooted anywhere, the way you could be surrounded by people constantly and still feel entirely alone. She told him things she had not told anyone in Caldwell about her childhood in Missouri, about her father who had been a good man and a bad farmer and had died of fever when she was 17, about her mother who had remarried too quickly and too poorly, about the sequence of decisions that had brought her west at 20 and into the work she did now. "You have never wanted to do something other than bookkeeping?" he asked. "I wanted to teach school," she said, "when I was young. My father taught me to read very young and I loved it and I thought," she stopped. "But circumstances are what they are. Bookkeeping is practical and respectable and pays well enough." "You could still teach," he said. "I am 26 years old," she said. "That is not old," he said. "That is not even close to old." He said it with such mild certainty that she found herself almost believing it. After dinner, they walked back toward Mrs. Elroy's through the quieter streets, where the drive-day noise had moved itself into the saloons and left the residential blocks in relative peace. The night was cooler than the evening before, a light wind from the north carrying the promise of the coming autumn. At the foot of the porch steps, Rose turned to face him. "Your week ends on Sunday," she said. "Yes," he said, "and you go back to Wichita." "With Farr in custody, yes." She looked at the porch steps. She looked at her hands. She looked at the night sky over the frame houses of Caldwell, Kansas, where she had been alone and content and entirely, she now realized, not content at all. "I have been afraid," she said very quietly, "for a long time, of this particular thing." "I know," he said. "I told myself that being unmemorable was a kind of safety," she said. "That if no one noticed me particularly, then no one could." She paused. "No one could decide that I was insufficient after they had noticed me. No one could look at me carefully and then choose to go." "Rose," he said, "I am telling you this because it is important that you understand it," she said, her voice steady. "Because if you are going to propose a future that involves Caldwell and permanence, then you should know what you are working with. I am not an easy woman. I have edges and opinions, and I will argue with you when I think you are wrong, and I will not apologize for it." "Good," he said. "I do not wear my heart on the surface," she said. "I keep it very carefully maintained in a location that is not easily reached." "I have noticed," he said, and there was warmth in it. "But it is there," she said, "and it has been paying very close attention to you for 4 days." He reached out and took her hand, and the contact was so simple and so warm that she felt it in her whole chest. "I am going to go back to Wichita," he said slowly, "and I am going to put in a request to the marshal's office for reassignment to a more permanent post. There is a town marshal position open in 2 or 3 places in this territory. Caldwell is one of them." He paused. "I am not going to tell you what to do with that information. I'm not asking for any promises. I am telling you that I intend to make different choices than I have made in the last several years, and that those choices are in no small part shaped by the fact that you are here, and I would very much like to be somewhere near where you are." She looked at his hand holding hers in the lamplight from Mrs. Elroy's porch. "You are a patient man," she said. "I have had some practice," he said, and she heard the 3 years in it without self-pity, just fact. She stood up on her toes and kissed him briefly and precisely on the cheek, which she had not planned to do and which surprised them both. "Good night, Clarence," she said. He was smiling when she turned to go up the stairs. She could hear it without turning around. The remaining days of his week went by in the specific way that time goes by when you are simultaneously dreading its passing and not yet ready to stop it. They walked and talked and ate, and the conversation between them found a register that felt like something being built, carefully and well. Harold observed this situation with the benign satisfaction of a man who considered himself indirectly responsible. Mrs. Elroy approved, which she expressed by setting out an extra biscuit on Rose's breakfast plate. On Saturday afternoon, Clarence asked her to come with him to the edge of the prairie again, and they sat in the tall grass in the particular late summer warmth that the plains stored up and released slowly, watching a hawk work the thermals overhead. "Tell me something you want," he said. "Not something practical, something you actually want." She thought about it honestly. "I want a garden," she said after a moment. "A proper one, not just the few herbs I keep in a window box at Mrs. Elroy's. A real garden with room for vegetables and flowers both. I want tomatoes in August and marigolds in September." "That is an excellent want," he said. "What do you want?" she asked. "A room with enough bookshelves," he said. "I have been carrying books in my saddlebag for years, and it is a completely inadequate arrangement." She laughed. "How many books?" "Currently 11, he said with some dignity. "It is difficult to manage. 3 of them are held together with lengths of cord. 11 books in saddlebags," she said, "on a circuit horse." "I know. You are a very strange man," she said with affection. "You are not the first person to reach that conclusion," he said. They sat in the grass for a while, comfortable in the silence the way that people are when they have talked enough that the silence between them has become a kind of conversation too. "I do not want you to go back to Wichita," she said finally. She had decided to say it plainly because he had given her plain things and she owed him the same. He was quiet for a moment. "I do not want to go," he said, "but I need to do it properly. I need to go through the right channels, file the right requests. I want to come back to Caldwell with something to offer you, Rose, not just a declaration, something real." "You do not need to offer me anything," she said. "I know," he said. "I want to." She looked at the hawk over the grassland, circling in its slow, patient way. "I will still be here," she said. "I will not disappear this time." His hand found hers in the grass. "I know," he said very quietly. "I believe you." Sunday morning came with a thin cloud cover and a wind that had finally turned fully to autumn, cool and carrying the smell of change. Clarence was outside Mrs. Elroy's boarding house at 7 in the morning with his horse, a sensible roan gelding, and his saddlebags, which Rose could see were in fact rather heavily weighted in what she suspected was the direction of books. He had Douglas Farr, hands bound, on a second horse behind him. The business of it, the work, the reality of who this man was and what his life required. Mrs. Elroy came out onto the porch in her good morning dress and presented Clarence with a package wrapped in cloth that Rose suspected contained biscuits and probably the last of the summer preserves. "For the road," Mrs. Elroy said, with the authority of someone who would not take no. "Thank you, ma'am," Clarence said, receiving it with genuine gratitude. Then he looked at Rose, who was standing on the porch with her shawl over her shoulders, and for a moment the morning was very quiet. "I will write," he said. "I know you will," she said. "I will be back as soon as I am able to come back properly," he said, "which will not be longer than 2 months if I can help it." "I will be here," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The town was just beginning to wake around them, a dog somewhere, the sound of a door, the distant lowing of cattle. "Rose Barrett," he said. "Clarence Malone," she answered. He nodded once, the way he did when something important had been established between them, and then he turned his horse and rode south on Main Street toward the Wichita Road, Douglas Farr following behind, until the dust swallowed them both and the morning was just the morning again. Mrs. Elroy put her arm around Rose's shoulders. "He will come back," she said. "Yes," said Rose. "I know." She went inside and ate her breakfast and then went to work, because she was a practical woman, and because work had always been what steadied her. And she sat at her desk in the dusty spur with her ledgers and her ink, and the particular quiet determination of a woman who had decided, somewhere between Wednesday and Sunday, to stop being afraid of wanting things. The letters started 3 weeks after he left. The first arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered from the post office by Thomas, the telegraph clerk, who clearly considered himself something of a romantic facilitator. Rose opened it at her desk before Harold arrived, in the particular privacy of an empty saloon before the day began. Clarence wrote the way he talked, direct and warm, without performance. He reported, practically, that Douglas Farr had been delivered to the Wichita Marshal's office without significant incident, that the paperwork was extensive and had occupied most of his first week back, and that he had formally submitted a request for reassignment to a permanent town marshal position. He mentioned that he had spoken to the federal district office about Caldwell specifically, and that there was in fact a need for a permanent marshal in town, though the process of appointment would take some time. And then, at the end of the letter, in handwriting that was slightly less even than the rest, as though written with a different kind of care, he had written, "I have thought about you every day since I left. I wanted you to know that the streak continues unbroken." Rose read that last part 3 times. Then she wrote him back. Her first letter was careful and measured, reporting on the accounts, the weather, Mrs. Elroy's opinion of the newly arrived Methodist minister, and a brief and somewhat dry account of an incident involving the Taggart crew and a pig that had somehow escaped from the stockyard. She had rewritten it twice before sending it because the first draft had been considerably more personal than she had intended. His reply came in 10 days and was twice as long as his first letter. Her reply to that came in 7 days. His reply came in 8. And so on, for 6 weeks, the letters growing longer and less measured as the distance between them filled with words, until Rose was writing to him things she had not said aloud to another living soul, and receiving back things that she read by lamplight and kept in a careful box in the back of the drawer of her nightstand. He wrote, "I have found that thinking about you has changed its nature somewhat. For 3 years it was a specific kind of ache, the way you feel a tooth that has been pulled, the absence more present than what was there. Now it is different. Now it is more like something anticipated." She wrote back, "I have been reconsidering the general arrangement of my life for the last 6 weeks, and I find that the arrangement, while satisfactory on its own terms, contains certain gaps that I had previously not acknowledged. The gaps are shaped approximately like a man who is very tall and has 11 books in his saddlebag." His reply to that contained the line, "I laughed for the first time in 2 weeks reading that sentence. I have been missing your particular way, with words more than I can properly say." Harold noticed the letters, because Harold noticed everything that happened in his establishment, and he said nothing except to make sure that whenever correspondence arrived from Wichita, the envelope was placed on Rose's desk immediately rather than waiting in the post box. Mrs. Elroy asked no direct questions, but began, around the 6th week, to leave fresh flowers from her window garden on the dining table on Tuesday mornings, which was approximately when the Wichita letters tended to arrive. The appointment was formally approved in the 2nd week of October. The letter that arrived with this news was the most excited Clarence had been in any piece of writing he had sent her. He had been appointed town marshal of Caldwell, effective the 1st of November. He would arrive the last week of October to take up residence and acquaint himself with the situation before the official start date. He would arrive in 11 days. Rose read this letter standing up because she had been at the post office when Thomas handed it to her, and she walked back to the saloon in the specific state of a woman who is deeply happy and is attempting to conduct herself normally, which was not entirely successful. Harold took one look at her face when she came in. "Good news from Wichita," he said. "Harold," she said. "Yes. He is coming back to Caldwell, permanently, as town marshal." Harold's face did something warm and genuine. "Well," he said. He came around the bar and patted her on the shoulder in the way of a man who was not comfortable with demonstrations but wanted to make one. "Well, then." The 11 days were both endless and swift in the way that anticipated things always are. Rose wrote back immediately, confirming that she had received the news, that the town would benefit from a permanent marshal, and that she was glad. She had written 4 more sentences after that and then deleted them, because they were too much for a letter, things that wanted to be said in person rather than in ink. She told Mrs. Elroy, who expressed her approval by baking an apple cake and announcing at the Sunday boarding house dinner that Caldwell was to have a permanent marshal, and that she personally thought it was the best news the town had received in years, to the general agreement of the other 3 boarders who had no idea why Mrs. Elroy was so particularly pleased about it. She took a walk on the prairie on the last Saturday before he was to arrive, alone, in the late afternoon, and she stood in the tall grass with the autumn wind moving through it, and looked at the wide sky and thought about what it meant to let yourself want something and then reach for it instead of retreating. She was 26 years old. She had built a modest, careful life. She had kept herself safe by keeping herself small. She thought about what Clarence had said, that she was wrong about herself, that the truth of her was something else entirely. She thought about the widow she had sat with, and the argument with Hensley, and the way she had run half the length of town to find a deputy marshal because Harold needed protecting, and it had simply not occurred to her to do anything else. She stood in the grass and she thought, maybe he is right. Maybe I have been wrong about myself for a very long time. The wind moved through the grass and the hawk made its circles and the sky was enormous over Kansas, and Rose Barrett, for the first time in years, felt entirely present in her own life. He arrived on a Wednesday. She was at her desk when she heard the sound of a horse on the street, and then, a few minutes later, the door of the saloon opened, and Clarence Malone came in with the same unhurried step she had memorized, and his eyes found her immediately across the full length of the room, and this time Rose put down her pen and stood up and walked toward him instead of looking away. They met in the middle of the saloon floor, which smelled of sawdust and last night's whiskey and the October wind that had come in with him. "You are here," she said. "I am here," he said. And then, because the saloon was empty except for Harold behind the bar pretending to be absorbed in polishing glasses, Rose Barrett did something she had not done in years, and perhaps had never done quite so deliberately. She stepped forward and took Clarence Malone's face in her hands and kissed him properly, the way she had been not kissing him for 6 weeks of letters and 3 years of absence. He kissed her back with the contained warmth of a man who had been patient for a very long time, and was now, entirely and with great relief, permitted not to be. Harold polished a glass and looked at the wall and smiled. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Rose's adult life, and she recognized this as she was living them, which she considered a particular gift, not looking back and remembering happiness, but knowing it while it was present. Clarence took up his position as town marshal on November 1st, and applied himself to it with the competence and steadiness that the town rapidly appreciated. He was not theatrical about it. He was not the kind of man who performed authority, but he was clear and consistent and fair. And Caldwell, which had been running a bit rough, settled somewhat in the way that towns do when they sense that their law enforcement is genuinely invested. He had taken rooms at the hotel initially, while the marshal's office quarters were prepared, but by the 3rd week of November he had arranged to rent a small house on the edge of town, a frame house, white painted, with a yard that included what had once been a kitchen garden. He showed her the garden on a Sunday afternoon when the frost had not yet fully come and the last of the autumn color was in the trees. "It needs considerable work," he said. Rose looked at the tangled, overgrown space and felt something bloom in her chest. "Tomatoes in August," she said, "and marigolds in September," he confirmed. She looked at him. He looked at her. They were standing in a frost-softened garden in Caldwell, Kansas in November of 1882, and the sky was the cold, clear blue of late autumn, and somewhere a few blocks over a dog was barking, and Rose thought, "This is what I was keeping myself from all this time. This ordinary, extraordinary thing." "I love you," she said plainly, because it was true and because she had decided to stop letting fear make her dishonest with herself or with him. He was quiet for exactly one breath. "I have loved you since October of 1879, he said. "I did not say it then because I was afraid of frightening you away. And then you left before I could say it at all, and I spent 3 years trying to figure out how to say it to someone I couldn't find." He paused. "And now I have found you, and I am standing in a ruined kitchen garden, and this is where I say it. I love you, Rose Barrett." She laughed, and the laugh was real and full, the kind that you give to someone you are entirely comfortable with. "This is a very unromantic setting," she said. "I will try to do better next time," he said. "No," she said, taking his hand. "It is perfect. It is exactly right." They were married in the spring in a small ceremony in the Caldwell First Methodist Church, which the new minister conducted with appropriate brevity and genuine warmth. Mrs. Elroy cried and then denied it. Harold Fitch served as witness and gave them, as a wedding gift, the complete set of leather-bound account ledgers that Rose had been using at the saloon for 2 years, with a note that said she would need them for the household accounts, and also that he would need to hire a new bookkeeper, which was going to be a problem. The wedding was on a Friday in March of 1883, when the first real warm air of the year had come up from the south, and the prairie around Caldwell was beginning to green. Rose wore her best dress, which was the color of sage, and carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that she had found along the creek that morning, and she stood in the church and looked at Clarence and felt, for the first time in her life, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, directly, completely, without reservation. And when the minister asked the question and he said yes, it was in the tone of a man answering a question he had known the answer to for a long time. They settled into the white house on the edge of town, with the comfortable ease of two people who had been talking to each other across distance and paper for months, and found in the daily proximity of actual shared life only a deepening of what they already were. Rose kept her bookkeeping work for the first year, though Harold hired an assistant and her hours shortened. Clarence's work as marshal gave the household its rhythm: the early mornings, the rounds, the occasional nights that ran long when there was trouble, which there sometimes was in a cattle town on the frontier. They argued sometimes, because they had both told the truth about themselves when it mattered. Rose was direct and had opinions and held to them, and Clarence was stubborn in his own steady way, and occasionally these qualities collided over things that mattered to them both. They argued once at length over what Rose regarded as Clarence's tendency to downplay his own needs in service of being reasonable, and Clarence argued in return that Rose had a persistent habit of reflexively declining help before she had assessed whether she needed it. Both arguments contained enough truth that they arrived eventually at the particular kind of resolution that makes two people understand each other more clearly, and they did not hold the arguments against each other once they were finished. She planted the garden in April. She started the tomatoes from seed in pots on the windowsill in February, small green shoots that she monitored with a seriousness that Clarence found genuinely endearing. The marigolds she planted from seed directly in the ground in May, and by August she had both. By August, she also knew that she was expecting a child. She told Clarence on an evening in August, sitting on the back porch of the White House while the summer light lasted. She had been thinking about how to say it all day, and in the end she just said it, plain and direct. "I am going to have a baby in February." He was still for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand and held it with the care of someone handling something precious, and he said, "February," and he said it the way some people say a holy word, with wonder and gratitude and a reverence for the fact of it. "February," she confirmed. He brought her hand to his lips and held it there for a moment. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said honestly, "but less than I thought I would be, with you here." "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why it is less." The autumn moved into winter, and Rose continued her bookkeeping work through November, at reduced hours, and spent more time at home as December brought the cold. Mrs. Elroy came to dinner every Sunday and clucked over her in the warm, practical way of a woman who had lived long enough to know that some things required hovering, and some things required simply being present. Harold hired a young man named Samuel for the accounts who was competent but slower than Rose, and he told Rose this with a rueful honesty that she found flattering. Clarence built additional bookshelves in the small room at the back of the house that had been his study, and then built more in the sitting room, because the books had multiplied since he was no longer living out of saddlebags. Rose's books mingled with his on the shelves, and she found this domestic intermixing of their libraries to be one of the most satisfying things about the marriage. Her history of the Roman Republic next to his collected Mark Twain, her herbal almanac beside his law texts. February came, and with it the cold and the particular kind of suspenseful waiting that attends the end of a pregnancy. The baby arrived on a Tuesday morning in the White House, attended by Mrs. Elroy and the town doctor, a steady woman named Dr. Clara Haynes, who had come to Caldwell the previous summer and was already considered indispensable. It was a boy. Clarence was in the kitchen when Dr. Haynes came to tell him, and Rose heard later from Mrs. Elroy that he had stood very still for a moment, and then sat down at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands, not from distress, but from the plain overwhelming of a feeling too large for a person to hold standing up. He came in to see her with the look of a man who had been cracked open in the best possible way. "He has your hands," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed, the baby wrapped in the flannel Mrs. Elroy had sewn through November and December. Rose looked at the baby, at his dark hair and his closed eyes and his impossibly small fingers. "He has your ears," she said. Clarence laughed low and a little unsteady. "What shall we call him?" Rose asked. They had discussed names but had not settled the way that some names require the actual presence of the person to feel right. Clarence looked at the baby for a long time. "Thomas," he said finally, "for my father's brother who taught me to ride and was a better man than most." "Thomas," Rose said, trying it. It fit. "Thomas Malone." She looked at her husband, at his silver-gray eyes that were somewhat bright in the winter light from the window, and at the way he looked at their son with the expression of a man who had only recently understood the full scope of what love was capable of. "Every day," she said quietly. He looked at her. "You said you thought about me every day for 3 years," she said. "I want you to know that I understand now what that means. I understand what it costs to keep something in your heart for that long without permission. And I am sorry that I made you wait, and I am grateful beyond words that you did." He leaned forward and pressed his forehead very gently against hers, baby Thomas between them in his flannel, the winter light coming in white and clean through the window. "You did not make me wait," he said. "You were living your life and being exactly who you were, and I was paying attention." A pause. "I will always pay attention." The spring came again, and with it the second summer, and the garden was better than the first year because Rose had learned the soil and adjusted accordingly. Thomas grew from a winter baby into a spring child into a summer toddler who sat in the garden dirt with absolute contentment and absolutely no concern for the marigolds he was systematically dismantling. Caldwell itself changed around them, as frontier towns did. The cattle drives continued, though the nature of the trade was shifting. The railroads were pushing further west and south, and the patterns of the cattle trade were slowly, year by year, transforming. The town added a proper schoolhouse in 1884, and the school board, aware that Rose Malone had once wanted to be a teacher and was known to have strong opinions about education, appointed her to the school committee, which she accepted and took seriously. She sat on the school committee meetings in the town hall and argued for longer school terms and better textbooks, and the inclusion of the children of the Mexican families who had settled on the south edge of town, some of whom were not initially made welcome in the school. She made these arguments in her precise, unrelenting way, and she won most of them eventually because she was patient and persistent, and because Caldwell generally respected people who knew what they were talking about. Clarence came to one of these meetings and watched her from the back of the room, and afterwards he told her that he had been right all along, and that she had been wrong about herself, and that it was a good thing for Caldwell that she had come here and stayed. "You are biased," she told him. "I am correct," he said. By the summer of 1885, Thomas was 2 years old and investigating everything within reach with a scientific persistence that exhausted and delighted them in roughly equal measure, and Rose discovered in July that Thomas would have a sibling the following winter. She told Clarence in the garden in the evening, while Thomas slept, and the fireflies were just beginning in the low places near the creek. Clarence received this news with the same quality he had brought to all the major events of their life, steadily, gratefully, with a kind of quiet joy that did not announce itself but was entirely real. "Marigolds in September," he said, looking at the garden, "and apparently a baby in winter." "Apparently," she agreed. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was the question that he asked her sometimes, not from doubt but from a genuine desire to know, because he was the kind of man who wanted the people he loved to be actually happy and not merely performing it. She looked at their garden, at the tomatoes heavy on the vine, at the marigolds blazing their gold and orange in the late summer light. She looked at the white house with the lamplight beginning to show in the kitchen window where Mrs. Elroy had come to sit with Thomas. She looked at her husband, who had ridden across 6 towns in 3 years and sat at a table in a saloon and waited for her to look up from her ledger. "Yes," she said, and she meant it as completely as she had ever meant anything. He took her hand in the garden and they sat together in the summer evening while the fireflies came up and the stars appeared one by one over the Kansas plains, and Barrett Rose Malone. She had to remind herself. She was still getting used to the name thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago, who had told herself she was unmemorable, who had made herself invisible as a form of protection, and she felt something that was not quite pity and not quite tenderness, but was the complicated feeling you have toward an earlier version of yourself, who was doing the best they could with the information they had. She had been wrong. She had been wrong, and he had been right. And here was the proof of it in tomatoes and marigolds and fireflies and the sleeping weight of a 2-year-old boy inside, and the particular warmth of a hand holding hers in the August dark. The second child arrived in December of 1885, a girl this time, and she came into the world with the loud and uncompromising announcement of someone who intended to make herself heard from the outset. Dr. Haynes laughed when she was born. Mrs. Elroy declared she had healthy lungs. Clarence looked at her with the pure astonishment of a man encountering a personality already fully formed. They named her Mie Louise, for Clarence's sister and niece both, and Mie announced her opinions about every aspect of her situation from approximately hour 2 onward, and gave no indication of planning to stop. Thomas, for his part, investigated his new sister with the same scientific persistence he applied to everything, decided she was acceptable, and went back to dismantling the kitchen. Harold retired from the saloon in 1886 and sold the Dusty Spur to a businesswoman from Wichita who kept it running well and made better coffee. He came to dinner at the Malone house regularly and taught Thomas card games that were probably not appropriate for a 4-year-old, but gave Thomas a head start in arithmetic that served him well later. Mie ran before she walked and climbed before she ran, and had strong opinions about horses from the first time she saw one. Thomas read before he was 4, which surprised no one in a house where the bookshelves covered 3 walls and 2 people regularly stayed up past midnight reading. He also had a talent for mathematics that Rose recognized as her own, which she found quietly moving. Some passing on of a thing she had spent her life doing quietly, now visible in her son. Clarence's work as marshal continued to suit him. He was good at it, patient and fair and firm when he needed to be. He made mistakes and acknowledged them, which the town respected more than it would have respected perfection. He helped build the jail and then helped reform the way it was run, because he had opinions about the dignity owed to people even when they had done wrong, and those opinions occasionally put him in arguments with the county sheriff, which Rose followed with interest and frequently weighed in on during the evening reports at the dinner table. Me, old enough now to sit at the dinner table and make contributions, declared at age 4 that she was going to be either a marshal or a horse doctor, and had not yet decided which. "You can be both," Clarence said, with perfect seriousness. Me considered this. "That is a very full day," she said. Rose and Clarence looked at each other over Me's head with the shared expression of parents who are doing their best not to laugh. The years arranged themselves into a life. Not a spectacular life by the measure of great ambitions. No fortunes made, no battles fought, no histories written. But a life that was real and good and full, in the way that lives are when they are attended to with care by people who have decided to be honest with themselves and with each other. There was the winter that the blizzard lasted 5 days, and they were snowed in together and read through most of the remaining books on the shelves and played cards and told the children stories, and were, all 4 of them, completely content inside the small warm house while the white world roared outside. There was the spring that the garden went wrong, and everything they planted seemed to come up crooked or not at all. And they planted again in June and got a small second season of something. There was the autumn that Me fell out of the apple tree and Clarence carried her to Dr. Haynes and sat in the waiting room for 45 minutes with Thomas on his lap and Rose's hand in his, and did not say a single word because there were no words adequate to the waiting. And then Dr. Haynes came out and said Me had a broken arm and the confidence of someone who had experienced far worse. There was the evening in the late fall of 1888, when Rose and Clarence sat on the back porch in the cold, Thomas and Me both asleep inside, the stars over Kansas very bright and very numerous, and they drank hot coffee and said nothing for a long time and did not need to. "Do you know," Rose said finally, "that I almost did not come to that corner that first evening, when you said you would be at Maine and Foster at 6:30. He looked at her in the dark. "I know," he said. "I was not entirely certain you would come." "I was ready at 6, she said. "I sat in my room for 25 minutes arguing with myself." He was quiet for a moment. "What made you go?" She thought about it honestly. She had thought about it before, in the way you turn something over to understand it fully. "I was tired," she said. "Not of Caldwell or the work or my life. I was tired of being afraid of you, of what you meant, of wanting something and not." She stopped. "I was tired of keeping myself away from my own life." He reached over and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him in the way she had become accustomed to, the easy fit of 2 people who have spent years learning the particular geography of each other's company. "I am glad you stopped being tired of it," he said. "I am glad you sat at Harold's table for an hour without saying anything," she said. "It was a strategy," he admitted. "It was an extremely effective one," she said. They sat on the porch in the cold and the starlight, and the night sounds of Caldwell moved around them, a dog, a distant voice, the particular silence of a town asleep, and Rose thought about the long, strange road from Dodge City to this porch, and all the years that had shaped her into the woman she was, and the other woman she had believed herself to be, the one who was unmemorable and easy to overlook. She thought about Clarence Malone riding into 6 towns looking for her. She thought about the way he had sat down at a table she had not invited him to and simply been present, patient as prairie stone. She thought about the way he had said it, there on the street outside Mrs. Elroy's in the dark, in the particular tone of a man reporting a plain fact, every single day. She had been wrong about herself. It was one of the best things that had ever happened to her, being wrong about that particular thing. In the spring of 1889, when Thomas was 5 and Me was 3 and the garden was better than it had ever been, Clarence was offered a promotion to Deputy Marshal for the region, which would have meant circuit work again, travel the road. He came home with the letter and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it the way he looked at difficult things, directly and without flinching. Rose read the letter. She set it down. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want what I have," he said simply. "I want this house and this town and this family. I want to be here when Thomas loses his next tooth and when me figures out how to saddle a horse properly and when you get the tomatoes in August." He paused. "I have had the road. I know what it is. This is better." She looked at him. "Then write back and decline," she said. He nodded once and picked up the letter and wrote a reply that afternoon that was courteous and clear. He remained Caldwell's town marshal. He declined the promotion. He came home for dinner. The tomatoes came in August. The marigolds came in September. Me did eventually learn to saddle her own horse, at age 5, and the argument she had with the horse about the whole procedure was one of the more entertaining things the neighborhood had witnessed in some time, ending in me's favor and the horse's grudging acceptance. Thomas, by age 7, had read everything in the house that was not the law texts and had begun requesting more from the traveling bookseller who came through Caldwell twice a year. He had his mother's precise mind and his father's patience, and a kindness toward smaller creatures that was entirely his own. On the evening of their 6th wedding anniversary, in March of 1889, Clarence presented Rose with a gift that he had been working on for some months, a small painting in watercolors, executed by a traveling artist who had come through Caldwell in January, of the garden at the back of the house. The artist had painted it from a description that Clarence had given, and from the artist's one brief look at the real garden, and it was not a masterpiece, but it captured the light of August in a way that was entirely recognizable. The gold and orange of the marigolds, the heavy red weight of the tomatoes on the vine, and in the corner of the garden, small and entirely unmistakable, a woman with her back turned, looking at the things she had grown. Rose stood in the kitchen holding the painting in the lamplight. "The back of my head," she said. "I thought it was rather good," he said. "It is," she said quietly. "It is exactly right." She hung it in the sitting room between the bookshelves, where it stayed for many years. There was no great catastrophe and no great triumph, and life was what life is, ordinary and extraordinary in the ways that are specific to the people living it, neither better nor worse than it deserved to be, which is to say it was good. It was not perfect. Clarence had his difficult seasons, times when the weight of the work settled on him, and he was quieter than usual and needed patience more than conversation. Rose had her own darknesses, the occasional descent into the old fear, the old smallness, when something went wrong and the voice that had told her for years that she was unmemorable and insufficient would surface again briefly. When it did, Clarence would come to find her in whichever room she was in and sit down and be present in the way she had first understood that evening at Harold's table, steady and patient and entirely refusing to accept the diminished version of herself as real. She would say sometimes, "I am being foolish." He would say, "You are not. I am the old way, the old thinking. I know," he would say, "it passes. You are very sure about that." "I have a good deal of evidence," he would say. And then he would read to her, or they would talk about something else, or she would simply sit next to him until the dark passed, which it always did. In the summer of 1890, Rose accepted the position of teacher at the Caldwell schoolhouse, which had been quietly made available after the previous teacher relocated to Denver. She was 34 years old when she took the job, which was not a conventional age to begin teaching, and she was aware of this, and she taught with the accumulated understanding of someone who had lived enough to know what was actually important. She taught arithmetic, which she was very good at, and she taught reading, which she loved, and she taught her students that the way they saw themselves was not always accurate, and that it was worth examining carefully. She told this last thing to a girl of 11 named Clara, who sat at the back of the room and made herself small in the way that Rose had once made herself small, and she said it directly and looked Clara in the eye and meant it with everything she had. Clara grew up and did not forget. The frontier itself continued to change. The cattle drives that had defined Caldwell's character were diminishing as the decade turned, the railroads extending further, the patterns of the trade transforming. Barbed wire was crossing the open range. The great drives were becoming history while they were still happening. The territory around Caldwell was settling into farms and small towns, and the ordinary future that had always been coming, whether the wild years had wanted it or not. Clarence watched it with the thoughtful attention of a man who had ridden through the frontier and understood what it had been and what it was becoming. He was not romantic about it. He had seen enough of the frontier to know that the poetry of it was purchased at a considerable cost, much of it paid by people who had never had a choice about paying it. But there was something in the passage of it that he acknowledged with respect, the way you acknowledge the end of a particular kind of weather. "What will this country be?" Thomas asked once at the dinner table with the earnest curiosity of a 7-year-old who had been listening to adult conversation and drawing conclusions. "Different," Clarence said. "Better in some ways, worse in some ways, more settled, which has its own costs and its own gifts. Will you still be marshal?" "For a while," Clarence said, "and then perhaps something else. People find other kinds of work when the work changes." Thomas considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "I am going to be a doctor," he announced. This was new information, Rose noted, and different from his previous announcements about being a lawyer or a bookseller. "A doctor," Rose said. "That is demanding work." "Dr. Haynes makes a difference," Thomas said. "I want to make a difference." Clarence looked at Rose over Thomas's head. Rose looked back. Something passed between them that was plain and warm and needed no translation. Mee declared that she still intended to be a marshal and possibly also a horse doctor, and nothing about the dinner conversation had changed her position on either point. In 1891, Rose Malone turned 35 years old. She had been in Caldwell for 9 years. She had been married for 8. Thomas was 7. Mee was 6. The garden was in its 8th year and had become the kind of garden that passes the point of effort and arrives at the character of an established place. The marigolds returning reliably from seed each year. The tomatoes moved to the sunniest corner where they produced more than the family could eat, and she gave the rest to Mrs. Elroy and to the church kitchen. She sat in the garden on a Sunday afternoon in late August, shelling beans that she would put up for winter. While Clarence sat in the chair he had moved out there and read, and Thomas lay on his back in the grass staring at clouds with the philosophically productive idleness of a summer child, and Mee was at the back fence having an involved conversation with a large toad that had taken up residence in the damp corner by the water barrel. It was an afternoon that would not be recorded in any history. It was not remarkable by any external measure. Nothing happened in it except what was already there. Rose looked at the beans in her hands and the garden around her, and the small house with the bookshelves showing through the back window, and she thought, for the last time, and with the complete finality of something genuinely laid to rest, "I was so wrong about myself." She had told herself she was the kind of woman men did not remember. She had told him so, once, on a fall afternoon in Dodge City, 9 years ago, with the cool certainty of someone who had made her peace with a diminished assessment. He had thought about her every day for 3 years. He had ridden across 6 towns. He had sat at Harold's table in the dusty spur and waited. And here was the evidence. 1 garden, 2 children, 8 years of marriage, 11 books no longer in a saddlebag but properly shelved, and a watercolor painting of August light in the sitting room, and a toad in the corner by the water barrel, and Thomas in the grass, and Clarence looking up from his book to find her across the garden and smiling the way he smiled, the one that started at the corners of his eyes. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. "I was thinking," she said, setting down the beans, "that you were right." "I am frequently right," he said, with the mild composure of a man who knew this was not always true. "About what specifically?" "About me," she said. "You were right about me." He set his book down. "You were always right about you," he said, in the quiet way of someone saying something that has been true for a long time. You just needed someone to hold still and say so until you believed it. You are very patient, she said. I had a very good reason to be, he said. Me turned away from the toad and announced that his name was Gerald and that he was living with them now, which opened a separate and entirely vigorous discussion. Thomas sat up from the grass to weigh in on the subject of Gerald, with the full force of his 7-year-old opinion. The afternoon moved into evening, and the evening moved toward the long summer dark, and the Malones of Caldwell, Kansas sat in their garden while the fireflies began and the stars came out over the plains, and Rose Barrett, who had once believed she was the kind of woman men did not remember, was entirely, completely, permanently home. Gerald the toad, for what it was worth, stayed through the rest of the summer and was treated with the full dignity that Me's household guests could expect, and Clarence, who drew the line at most things, found that he could not make a persuasive argument against a toad who minded his business quietly in the corner and ate a remarkable number of garden pests. Thomas eventually became a doctor, which was a story for another time but a good one. Me became a marshal, which surprised no one. And Rose and Clarence grew old together in the White House with the bookshelves and the garden, and every year in August the tomatoes came in heavy and red, and every September the marigolds blazed their gold and orange in the Kansas light. And it was enough, and it was everything, and it was exactly what they had made of 3 years and 6 towns and one honest, patient love that had refused to forget the truth of a woman who had once, mistakenly, believed herself forgettable.